Now, what then is toxic masculinity? Now, obviously, this is a modern term, and the Quran doesn't have toxic masculinity. But one could derive, there's something called toxic masculinity from the Sunnah. One could derive it. And again, this derivation, I understand it raises eyebrows and whatever. I mean, it is what it is. Much can be said. Time is always limited. And anyway, is it okay and permissible to find references to modern notions in classical understandings of the Quran and Sunnah? I'm of those who's open to this idea. What's wrong with that? But obviously the conservatives find that to be very problematic, and they don't want to rethink through the past. That's fine, that's on them. But in my humble opinion, you can find a understanding of toxic masculinity that is blameworthy in the seerah, in the Sunnah, and that is in the famous incident, Sahih Bukhari mentions it, that a group of women complained to the Prophet ﷺ that their husbands had abused them, physically abused them. And so they complained, they lined up outside the house of the Prophet ﷺ, and they're complaining that you need to do something, Ya Rasulullah. Our husbands are physically abusing us. And the Prophet ﷺ called the people of Medina. He gave a khutbah, not on Jum'ah, he gave a special khutbah. And he said, in this morning, today, a number of ladies came complaining that their husbands abused them. Then what did he say? These are not the best of your men. To me, this is an example of toxic masculinity. He's criticizing something that a man should not do. Saying, these are not the best of your men. لَيْسُوا بِخِيَارِكُمْ. Shouldn't be doing this. It's not praiseworthy. Using your physical strength in this manner, that's not being a man. In that sense, like we're saying, that's not being a man. It's literally that tone. It's like, these aren't the best of your men. To me, this is an example of toxic masculinity, where one finds that, yeah, there are things you can do as a man that some might consider manly, but they're not Islamically positive masculinity. So what are some examples that come to mind? And again, this is just a tentative list, and maybe in the Q&A or discussion we can do more. So I was thinking about this for a while. Obviously, this topic that a lot of us are involved in because of the zeitgeist of the time, but khair. So one of the things that I think is an example of toxic masculinity is power dynamics and control. Toxic masculinity is obsessed with dominance. It wants to control the feminine, control the female, control the wife and daughter. And it promotes the idea that a man should be aggressive in that notion of control. And in my humble opinion, the Quran and the Seerah is not about control. It is about leadership through respect and collaboration. There's no question leadership. For those who attended yesterday, I don't want to go over that whole talk I gave at INT. I don't want to go over that whole talk.
Please don't.
Yeah, don't go over that whole talk. So I had to summarize some aspects of that. We can do that. But without a doubt, the Quran talks about male leadership in a marriage. There's no question about this. الرِّجَالُ قَوَّامُونَ عَلَى النِّسَاءِ. Leadership is not the same as domination. Leadership is not the same as being bossy. So the Quran is talking about healthy masculinity. And the Seerah teaches us that leadership comes not by raising your voice and screaming and shouting, but by earning the respect of your wife. Your wife genuinely respects you and gives you that authority because you have earned it by virtue of the fact you are acting the way a husband should act. Yes, you're still the leader. No question about it. That's what the Quran, I'm not mincing my words here. Two people can't drive the same boat. Two people can't drive the same ship. Two people can't steer the same car. There's no question the Quran has الرِّجَالُ قَوَّامُونَ عَلَى النِّسَاءِ وَالرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. But that daraja and that qiwama is not done by flexing your physical muscles in the face of your wife. What type of leadership is that? It has to come genuinely. And we know this from the corporations that we all know. Genuine leadership that works is a leadership that the people respect. Not a leadership that they despise and hate. Not a leadership that is threatening to fire every worker. When you respect your boss, when you respect the company CEO, when you respect the ethos, you will give your full and the whole company will flourish. And when that respect isn't there, you're just waiting to leave, that company is not going to flourish. So, toxic masculinity versus Islamic healthy masculinity. The second point about toxic masculinity, I would say, is the overall rigidity when it comes to gender roles. That toxic masculinity wants to be super strict according to the letter of the law that they have read. And whatever they think a man should do, even down to the minutiae of the lists of what a man or woman should do, they wish to enforce in their personal lives. Whereas healthy masculinity is flexible in understanding gender roles, acknowledging that at times a man can be a caregiver to the children, at times a man can also do the chores of the household, at times a man can also do whatever is typically what the woman does. It's not going to hurt your manhood. But a toxic masculine trait, I'm never going to do the dishes. I'm never going to take care of the kids. I'm never going to do this and that. As if you have to prove some list you've made in your head. So toxic masculinity is obsessed with the rigidity of gender roles. Whereas real human beings understand sometimes we have to swap roles, not a problem. It doesn't hurt my manhood if I have to do what generally my wife does. And once in a while, if I'm sick or whatever, if my wife has to do what I have to do, no problem. It doesn't hurt my manhood in this regard. So understanding the human reality of lived experience, rather than wanting to enforce a strict notion of what it means of gender roles. And we talked about gender roles yesterday as well, so we don't want to go there. But I think this is another example of toxic versus healthy masculinity. There's no question there are default roles. There's no question. But these default roles, you can modify them if time and place need. You can change them. You can swap a few hours, a few days. It's not going to hurt my manhood to do so. But to be obsessed, I'm never going to, it's not yet, that's your job to do. You're not going to flourish in this regard. That's not real masculinity. And we find this in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. Without a doubt, the default is that our mothers were the caretakers. Our mothers took charge of the home, without a doubt. Yet our Prophet ﷺ, we all know that he would also do his own chores. There's no hurt to your manhood. He would stand up and go milk the goat, which was considered a feminine task. He would stand up and get water he wouldn't just tell his wife, oh, give water to me. He would go and get his own water. Even though the cultural norms of the time were that the woman serviced the husband. That's the cultural norm. But again, it doesn't hurt my manhood to be nice to my spouse. It doesn't hurt my manhood to organically modify those cultural roles. So this is a second example of toxic versus healthy masculinity. A third manifestation and example is the false notion of toxic masculinity that men should not display emotions, that men should be stoic, that men cannot have feelings, cannot be hurt, cannot cry even. And this is patently false. The Prophet ﷺ cried multiple times in public. Multiple times. His son is dying in his hand and the tears are coming from his face. And even the Sahaba are like, وَأَنْتَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ تَبْكِي? You also cry? Because they hadn't usually seen him cry, right? But, I mean, your son is dying in your hand, you're not going to cry? I mean, there's a problem if at that stage you think your masculinity prevents you from shedding tears, then you have a serious problem. And that's what our Prophet ﷺ said, that البكاء رحمة جعله الله في قلوب عباده. Crying is Allah's mercy He has placed in the hearts of His servants. If your heart is that cold that you need to prove your manhood. And the other example of Al-Aqra' comes when the chieftain came. And the Prophet ﷺ was throwing Hassan up in the air. And he was kissing Hassan, right? And the chieftain in his harshness, he goes, you pick your kids up and kiss them? That's a feminine thing. I have 10 children. I have never once picked them up and kissed them. because he needed to prove he's a man. A man doesn't pick up the kids. A man doesn't kiss children. That's a woman does that. And our Prophet ﷺ said, what can I do if Allah has removed all compassion from your heart? You're that hard-hearted, you're that arrogant, that stuck up, that you think being a man means you can't show love to your kids, can't play with your wife and children, then what can I do? This is toxic masculinity. These are examples of toxic masculinity, where you need to make a point. A man doesn't do that. What world are you living in? Again, we see this in reality. And now, to be fair and to be accurate, please don't misunderstand me. Generally speaking, and this is reality, men have a higher level of emotional tolerance than women. And that's factually correct. We all know this, even biologically, scientifically. But to claim that men shouldn't have emotions is what I'm talking about. To claim that men should never display emotions, men should never be vulnerable, men should never cry, men should never show compassion. This is what I'm talking about. I'm not saying the two are the same. Clearly they're not the same. And there is hikmah in this, because one of the two genders needs to be more logical and rational, and one of them needs to be more loving and empathetic. And the two comes together, work great on a team. You need that team for the children. You need one of them that's more concerned about long term, even if it means they have to go to sleep and wake up and go to the work the next day, and the other one spends the whole night awake because the son or daughter is in fever. You need that yin and yang. You need that opposite in order for the team to flourish. So I'm not saying, don't misquote me, that men and women have the same emotional makeup. Of course they don't. But what I am saying, they're both emotional. And to claim that the one is not is toxic masculinity. And to claim that men should never be vulnerable, should never display emotion. No, agreed. And I'll say this bluntly, the bar is generally higher for men. That's very true. And there's nothing wrong with this. And it doesn't make women lesser. As I said, there's no competition. The problem comes when you think there's competition. We need our mothers to be more loving. We need our wives to be more empathetic. That's the reality. That's yin and yang is there. But to claim that men should never display emotion, and to display emotion is a sign of weakness, that is what I'm saying is toxic masculinity. It's okay to let loose, and especially in front of your wife, to find that safe comfort zone with your wife and spouse. Our Prophet ﷺ sees Jibreel and he's petrified. Who does he go running home to? Not Abu Talib, who was his father figure, not Talib, who is his mother figure, not any of his cousins that he grew up with. He goes running home to Khadija, trembling, so frightened. Zammiluni, dathiruni. And Khadija hugs him, because every man here knows you need the love of your wife when you're most down. And that comforts you like nobody else can comfort you. You need your wife to literally just hug you and tell you, I'm here, it's okay, it's all going to be good. There's nothing wrong with that. And to presume there's something wrong with that is toxic masculinity. Is that clear? Right? Now, how often does that happen? Once every 5, 10, 20 years in the seerah, like, yeah, okay, shouldn't happen every single time. But every once in a while, life gets tough and you need just cheering up. Even in the battle and the Hudaybiyah, right? When the Prophet ﷺ saw none of the Sahaba respond to his call, he couldn't let out in front of the Sahaba. Because again, there is an element, the bar is higher. So I am being blunt here. The bar is higher amongst men. A real man, without a doubt, on the default, the bar is raised higher. But you need safe space. So what does he do? He goes to Salama and he opens up to her. And he confides in her. And she can see the distress and the pain. Vulnerability. That pain, she can see it. Because a man needs a woman. And there's nothing wrong with lowering that guard in front of your wife to find that comfort, to find that wisdom. Any man who thinks that's a problem, without a doubt, that's toxic masculinity there. Okay? So that's point number what? What number is that? Guys, nobody's taking notes. Wala Shaykh. It's all good. Now we move on to number 4 then. Number 4. A fourth point, the mechanisms of conflict resolution. I would say this is an obvious distinction between toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity. When conflict happens, how do you resolve it? Toxic masculinity is done by flexing the muscles, literally and metaphorically, raising the voice, giving commands, expecting blind obedience, shouting, threatening, divorce, if you don't do this, da-da-da. I challenge you to find one instance in the seerah in which the Prophet ﷺ said to his wives, if you don't do this, I'm going to divorce you. It's not what a man does. Constantly threatening your wife with a divorce? What type of marriage is going to last like that? What type of bravery is that? Wallahi, it is the essence of cowardice, and you are not a man. If every time an argument happens, you threaten your wife, if you dare do this, main tumko talaq de dungi. This is Pakistani drama. It's not real life. And honestly, our Pakistani dramas are a big fitna because they miseducate about fiqh and about how a marriage should be. Complete disaster. Well, anyway, that's a whole different topic altogether. What was I saying about Pakistani dramas? Q&A. We still have 5 minutes.
No, I'll ask you about it.
Okay. I don't watch Pakistani dramas.
Then how do you know?
But somebody in my family does.
Used to, right?
And it's like, I just don't understand. It's always the same routine. Shadi kar lo, shadi nahi karoge, talaq de dungi. With 3 lines, always the same thing over and over again. Seriously, just... Anyway, okay. Enough of Pakistani dramas. Where was... So, point number 4 was what? Conflict resolution. How do you think a man, a real man, resolves conflict? Men, how do you think a man should resolve a conflict? Tell me. Communication, exactly. Communication, talk, empathy, understanding, shura. Don't threaten, raise your voice, give empty. What type of... You are the boss. If you have to tell your employees, I am the boss, you've lost your boss status. You understand what I'm saying here? Any boss that goes in and threatens the employees, I'm your boss, I'm going to fire you. All the employees have lost their respect. You don't need to mention you're the boss if you're really the boss. And without a doubt, a man is a leader in a marriage. I'm not going to mince my words here. I don't care about political correctness. I believe in the Quran, and I believe in biology, and I believe in genuine, healthy masculinity and femininity. A man is the leader. But if he needs to say he's the leader, he's not a leader. If he needs to constantly flex that he's the leader, he's failed in being the leader. A leader doesn't need to boast he's the leader. A leader acts like one. And when he acts like one, then those that should follow understand and they follow. Because he's earned the respect of those that need to follow. So conflict resolution is done from within, not from without. It is done talking, dialogue, empathy. That's healthy masculinity. Because in the end of the day, your wife is not your enemy. She's on your team. She's on your team. You are one group. If you need to take your wife as an enemy, you've lost the entire marriage. So toxic masculinity resolves conflicts via aggressiveness, via threats, via raw displays of power. And real men, healthy men. And that's why, again, the interesting incident of the seerah. It is funny, it is what it is. Where Abu Bakr as-Siddiq visited the house of Aisha radiallahu anha, his daughter, when the Prophet was there, and he heard our mother Aisha raising her voice loudly, rebuking, getting angry. And the Prophet is silent. Right? This is an awkward incident, but it's in our books. I'm not inventing this up. This is a real man. I'm sorry to be blunt here. This is a real man. What does he lose? Let your wife get angry for whatever. We don't even know the reason. It's not our business to know the reason, by the way. But any married couple, you know this. Sometimes your wife is irritated for a legitimate reason. Let her express some frustration. You don't lose your manhood. You don't lose your masculinity. And the Prophet is silent. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh loses the temper. And he barges in. It's his daughter's house, and he knows that it's his daughter. There's no awra there. He barges in, and he raises his hand to smack his own daughter and say, how dare you raise your voice above the voice of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Are you not terrified Allah will punish you with an adhab? And as he raises his hand, Aisha jumps up. She doesn't know what to do. She runs behind the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The same one she's screaming at, now she runs behind him to protect, right? And so the Prophet raises himself up to physically protect his wife when they're having an argument, and now some physical pain will come. This is what you call a man. Brothers, you're listening to me. This is a gentleman. Between husband and wife, let it be, no big deal. But now, and this is not a threat, but it's his own father, and he has the right in that culture, he has the right to discipline his daughter. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Times were different back then, okay? Even when we were growing up, our parents disciplined us, by the way, right? Only now, in the last 15 years, in my generation and in your generation, you know how the world was back then. Only now our kids are going to call 911 because they've been taught by Disney and whatnot. Otherwise, this was the reality for 10,000 years. No problem. Parents discipline their kids, okay? And in this case, Abu Bakr feels entitled. I'm going to discipline my daughter. How dare you do this? This is not how you treat your husband, right? The father says to the daughter, that's a different dynamics. As for the husband, chup chap, quiet. No need to. Because in the end of the day, he is in charge. And he doesn't need to prove it by raising his voice. And this is wisdom. And this is long term. You see all of this taking place here, right? So anyway, point number 4. Last point I'll mention before Asif Bhai kicks me off the stage. Last point I'll mention is what I'll call perceptions of strength. What it means to be strong. How do toxic masculine people portray their strength, and how does healthy masculinity portray their strength? Toxic masculinity goes back to my point that I said 20 minutes ago. Toxic masculinity is obsessed with physique to the point of it becoming narcissistic. Wallahi, it's a sickness. The level that is rampant amongst your generation. And again, please don't misquote me. I'm not saying being physically strong is unhealthy. I am saying to be obsessed with the physical completely and ignore the spiritual is not Islamic masculinity. And that is the default of masculinity of our times. That's what I'm saying. To be obsessed with physical power, with dominance, with a stoicism, with a veneer of I'm not going to have any, emotions. Whereas healthy masculinity takes into account the physique, and the physical body is secondary. That's not the main expression of masculinity. It's about genuine confidence in yourself and your abilities and your leadership. It is in understanding the role Allah has given you and accepting that role without needing to shove it in other people's faces, but in acting the part that Allah has given you. Oh men, you are the qiwam in the marriage. You don't need to prove it. Allah has given you that right. And biologically, men and women, wallahi, you don't have to be a Muslim. Biologically, if a man acts like a man in a relationship, the woman as a default will act like a woman. And the marriage is going to flourish. And women, if you act like a woman, the default is you're going to bring out the positive characteristics of healthy masculinity. This is the reality, right? So I want to conclude on this point, and that is that healthy masculinity and healthy femininity feed into each other in a positive synergy. Healthy masculinity and healthy femininity are not at war with one another. Rather, the two of them come together is the pinnacle of beauty and of love and of marriage and of relationship. Toxic femininity and toxic masculinity are at war with each other.